Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dorothy here from CCMA. Once again, you're very welcome to our second webinar with Dr. Nicola Millard, Principal Innovation Partner at BT. So delighted to welcome Nicola once again. We had a tremendous reaction, Nicola, to the last webinar and loads of requests for the white paper, which was great. So that's already up on the website for people to download. As always, I'm just going to give a couple of minutes for people to log in. I can see people coming in as I speak, so everybody is very welcome. If you can just give me a thumbs up as you come in to let me know you can hear and see okay. On screen, you'll see myself, Dorothy, Niamh from WSI, hi Niamh, and Dr. Nicola Millard, our guest speaker today. So the topic today, if I get it right now, disruption, Dolly, Dilbert and Droids. Am I saying that right? The D's reshaping the future of work and the contact centre. And I think we were just talking before we came on that everybody's at the point now of asking what is the future of the contact centre, where are we at, how is it going to look in 6 months time, 9 months time, a year's time, and CCMA have just undertaken their own survey on this, and we'll have our results hopefully for everybody back end of next week, if not early the following week. But I think we're all interested to see how things will look and the shape of that, and I think Nicola is going to share some insights on that with us today. So delighted to do that. So Nicola, if it's okay with you, I'll hand over and I'll let you take over from here. And as always, just to mention to everybody, any questions, please put them in the little panel to the right. I'll bring them to Nicola's attention and we'll most likely take them towards the end, but put them in the box, and if they're urgent, I can ask as we go through the presentation. So thanks a million, Nicola, and enjoy everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. So hello, everybody. For those of you who weren't at the last webinar, where were you? We were talking about customers the last time. I'm going to talk about employees this time, but just to reintroduce myself, in case you don't know me, my name is Nicola. I did used to be BT's futurologist, but got really fed up of the crystal ball jokes. So I am now slightly more sensibly known as a Principal Innovation Partner. So I work for BT's innovation team. I always have to, I think I'm contractually obliged to put this particular slide up in that we always have to tell people a little bit about BT and BT's innovation capability, because frankly, we don't talk about it enough, and part of my role is to raise people's awareness that we do research and innovation. So we're actually the third largest investor in research and innovation in the UK. We're behind a couple of pharmaceutical companies, and I am currently standing in my lovely kitchen in Ipswich, and Ipswich is significant because about 7 miles that way is Adastral Park, which is the hub of BT's innovation organisation. So there's about 5,000 people on site there doing all sorts of exciting things, not just innovation, but there's other practical stuff as well. And then we have a lovely innovation ecosystem, which for the sake of this presentation actually spans a lot of global universities. So you'll see a fair amount that we've done with Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Lancaster University, Cambridge University. So lots and lots of clever people working on a lot of this innovation stuff. So I talked about customers in the last webinar and customer behaviours, because behaviours are my thing. I am a psychologist. I have been working in the contact centre industry for more years than I would care to admit. My PhD was on contact centres, so I'm interested really in the psychology around both customers and employees. So customers was the last webinar, employees are really this webinar. And this is all about the future of work, and a fair proportion of my job is around the digital workplace, which is of course wider than the contact centre. But given the audience today, what I've tried to do is relate a lot of the stuff that we've been looking at around the digital workplace and apply it to the contact centre. And you'll also notice that a lot of the trends that I'm going to talk about begin with the letter D, disruption being the first one. I keep saying I think secretly I'm a Sesame Street fan, so probably not so secretly now, but I always say this session comes at you by the letter D. So the first D is around disruption, and although I've been working in the future of work area for about 9 or 10 years now, and prior to that had done a fair amount around workplace transformation, I think you'd probably agree that in the past 3 months, we have seen way more workplace transformation than we've ever seen, probably ever, and certainly in the past 3 years. And of course, the talk prior to the pandemic was a lot to do with the droid, which I'm going to be covering later. So automation, AI, was supposed to be disrupting the workplace and changing the future of work. Now, it may still do that, but of course it wasn't automation that changed the face of the way that we worked. It was a global pandemic, and I think very few of us would anticipate that a lot of our employees, including ourselves, would be working from home at this point in time. Although home working is a very old concept, and I'll show you how old in a minute, it had to be some kind of impetus to make us think very differently about the way that we work. And of course, we've got other things that we need to think about as we exit the pandemic. Obviously, there is going to be a massive global recession or depression, depending on which economist you talk to. So there's going to be a lot of focus in on cost. But actually, traditionally, when we look at crisis, there's always a real emphasis on innovation as well, because there's a limit to the amount of cost cutting you can do and survive. Actually, a lot of this is about innovating. And then, of course, there is another crisis looming as well, which is around the climate crisis and the climate emergency. And I keep saying, if you look at the number of deaths on climate versus COVID, the climate crisis is likely to kill more people globally than the coronavirus pandemic. It will just occur over a much longer period of time. So there's a lot of discussion around what do we learn from this crisis? And as Paul Romer, the economist, says, you know, crisis is a terrible thing to waste. What do we learn from this crisis as we emerge? All of the positive things that have come out. What do we take forward? Maybe some of the negative things we need to learn from. So I think, you know, this crisis is slightly different than some of the other crises, and I think hopefully we'll be taking some of these workplace trends way into the future. But I said, you know, home working isn't particularly new. One of my other Ds I call the death of Dilbert, and this is, I'm not killing Dilbert, by the way, he's far too sweet, but that sort of worldview of an office and a cubicle or a contact centre is an interesting debate. Now, home working in BT has gone on for a very long time. I joined BT, as you can see, a very long time ago. And one of my first jobs in BT, I was obviously only 6 at the time, but one of my first jobs was one of Europe's first home working experiments. And that home working experiment was done in the context of a contact center type job. In 1992, we got 11 volunteers who worked on directory inquiries to volunteer to work from home for a whole year. Now, this was, to be honest, primarily a technology trial. We're a technology company. We wanted to prove to see if the technology worked. Now, I was a very small cog in a very big wheel in this project, but I was part of the psychological monitoring team because we weren't sure whether these guys were going to go nuts during the year because we'd never tried this before. But I will comment that firstly, they didn't go insane. In fact, they enjoyed it. We got a lot more positivity in terms of their engagement. Actually, the service levels went up. The lady actually in the picture there did say, I've learned to cook and discovered who my neighbours are. I think we've all done that actually in the past 3 months. But the problem then was we did have an interesting solution. Technologically, you will see that that lady was using video. So we made sure that they didn't feel isolated, and video conferencing at the time, I mean, that video conferencing unit is about the size of a fridge. It was of brilliant quality, but we were trying to make sure that these guys could contact and see other people. We put in bulletin boards and email and all sorts of things. We even engineered bespoke desks for them and built those desks and transported them up to Scotland, only to find that we couldn't fit them through the doorways of the people, that the volunteers. So we had to dismantle them and rebuild them in their houses. So all sorts of things we learnt from this. But I will comment that in 1992, we did not have broadband, we did not have Wi-Fi, we didn't have 4G, we didn't have 5G. We literally had to dig their front gardens up and put a pipe into their house in order to do all of this stuff. And as a consequence, although we got a lot of really positive stuff out in 1992, because it cost £11,000 a seat, you can probably see why we didn't do it then. Now, since then, obviously BT was embraced home working massively as broadband became much more prevalent. by about 2000, a fair proportion of our employees actually did work from home, including a certain amount of contact center advisors, although probably a smaller percentage than our knowledge workers. So I must confess, I was never a home worker. I was always someone who studied home working. I wasn't necessarily a great home worker. And I must confess, I did struggle when we did have to transition to home working. The difference, of course, being our volunteers were back in 1992. I don't think very many of us volunteered to work from home this time. We didn't have a choice. So to be honest, I woke up about a week into the pandemic and thought, I'm terrible at home working. What can I do to help? And I know that some of our BT people have been working from home for over 20 years. So my natural instinct was to reach out to those guys and say, how do you do it? And over 100 of them came back and gave me some hints and tips. And those hints and tips were so good, we turned it into a white paper, which if you are interested, we can absolutely share. And we came up with these 5 key things to think about. And obviously, you know, I think most of us are sort of slightly bedding into home working now, but there's some obvious stuff around the environment you use, even just getting a good chair. And working with a couple of our customers on the contact center side, and actually BT as well, I think there was a lot of raiding of the centralized contact center to get things like screens and chairs that were ergonomics, because people didn't have those at home. Obviously, the home environment itself, it has really exposed a divide between the younger employees who often may be working from an ironing board in a shared house versus older employees that might well have a study that they can use. So it has exposed, you know, whether you can work from home or not. And certainly there have been a lot of compensation that we've been looking at around how do we actually bring people that simply can't work from home for various reasons into either the contact center or the office, because it doesn't work for everyone. But certainly there's a lot of stuff around setting routines. Easier if you're on a shift, to be honest. And we've just done some interviews with both agents and managers, and I think because you know, there's a clock on, clock off aspect to a lot of contact center work, it's slightly less problematic than knowledge workers who simply don't know when to turn off. But I think there's all sorts of things around keeping healthy, break taking, having a stretch, walking the dog, all of those things you can do as a home worker and are positively encouraged to do, whilst simultaneously maybe not raiding the fridge every 10 minutes, or in my case, drinking lots of coffee. I think 9 went down one day, and I paid for that one. So I'm limiting myself to 3. I'm on my 3rd already to date, you might have noticed. And obviously using the technology that underpins a lot of this stuff effectively. That includes making the technology secure, which is really important in that contact center environment. So we've learned how to deploy a lot of that very rapidly, and obviously things like cloud help. But, you know, are we going to be working from home for the rest of our lives? Probably not. And I think most of us have learned that home working permanently can be quite hard. And as I said, you don't always have the appropriate space in a home. Actually, we are social creatures. So I get asked an awful lot around, you know, are we ever going to go back to offices? And the answer prior to the pandemic was, of course, offices are going to thrive because they're places that we go to socialize about work. But when you look at the concepts that have been bandied around the 2-meter office, for example, maybe they're not as sociable as they used to be. And I used to talk about Dilbert's cubicle being taken down. Actually, those cubicles are going back up. So we're having to look at reconfiguring the office. And one consequence of that is that we have to reduce the capacity of our office spaces. And of course, offices were always engineered to get that maximum bums on seats, really. So it was all about, you know, minimizing the amount of space per person. Now we're having to separate people out a little bit more. Capacities are reducing, and you get bottlenecks in offices as well. So when we look at lifts, for example, maybe we can only get 1 or 2 people in a lift at any one time. So if you're on the 35th floor, either you're going to get very fit or you're going to spend a lot of time queuing, which is why we're getting a lot of conversations around rota systems and the death of the 5-day week and the death of the 9 to 5. So actually, sometimes we may have a proportion of our employees by necessity working from home because there isn't necessarily capacity in the contact center, and prioritization should be made for those people that can't work from home. But lots of other discussions going on in this area, and I really had the privilege of talking to some leading thinkers in places like London Business School and MIT around where we think the dynamics of office spaces and contact centres are going. So actually, in terms of physical spaces, because contact centre work is becoming a little bit more varied, so it's not all about phone calls anymore. And of course, phone calls are all about acoustic environments. Now we're getting, a mixture of, calls and chat, email. There are different spaces that actually, you don't necessarily need acoustic shielding to do chat sessions. And of course, I'm sure some of you recognise the fact that Airbnb, for example, had some incredible contact centres, which were more geared around activity-based working, which was really around moving to an environment that supported what you were doing rather than necessarily being fixed to one seat. So you could stand up, walk around, go into a quiet environment, go into other environments, and obviously, again, the technology potentially can untether us from those desks that we're often anchored to. And I always love watching people in contact centres because people do stand up and stretch and walk around, and sometimes the headset is a little bit of a problem if it's not wireless. So how do we think creatively about those spaces when we're in them and when it's safe to be in them? Well, there's been a lot of discussion around co-working spaces as well. I used to call these coffices, and I'm a knowledge worker, I'm not a contact centre worker, but I quite like working in a coffee shop when I could do that. But there's been a lot of discussion around co-working spaces, and particularly with that, a lot of people getting quite anxious around using public transport to get to the office. Is there an option to have a space which is an office, which does have potential access to all of the stuff that offices have, including people around you, but be within a walk or a cycle ride away? And we have looked at community contact centres before in the past, and that can attract a number of real positive things. Firstly, you can get some very different people in your contact centre. Certainly both home working and co-working spaces can open opportunities for potentially older employees, carers, so working mums and carers that are juggling things and can't necessarily work, a standard 9 to 5, I commute in, a commute out type shift. And then these are, again, this is some old work that we did on home-based advisors, 3 very typical advisors: the mum, the person that would prefer to have a commute that involves slippers rather than public transport or getting in a car. Again, climate emergency. We need to think about whether our journeys are absolutely necessary post-pandemic. And obviously, Anthony, actually, he's an engineer, so he's a real expert who wouldn't have been retained. He's semi-retired. He doesn't want a 9 to 5. He doesn't want to commute, but he's got a really good brain and a lot of experience. So how do we keep those kind of people in the workforce? So it can open up a much more diverse workforce potentially if we think about different ways of working. Now, there's lots of other things we've been talking about that have been accelerated by the pandemic. And one area we've been looking at is not just office-based people or home-based people. There's the bit in between. They're the remote workers, often field workers. And there's been some quite interesting stuff around remote diagnostics, for example. Now, this space has been accelerated hugely by the pandemic, not so much in terms of virtual reality. I would say some of the problems with virtual reality, I think, has been exposed by the pandemic, although it's kind of a cool technology. And we have, if you can see, Nicola Sturgeon and Philip Janssen, our CEO, actually brandishing VR headsets, because we have been looking at using both VR and 5G in that instance to beam virtual classes from Glasgow University into your eyeballs. I think actually the problems with VR are largely around the fact that I am immersed, and I'm not sure I want to be immersed in a headset for 7 hours a day. It's actually a good tool for things like learning and simulation, but may not be a great tool for sitting on meetings all day. It can be very disorienting for a start, and to be honest, I call it vomity reality. You need a bucket if you put a headset on me. So it doesn't necessarily work so well if you're going to spend all day in it. But I would say one of the things that has become really, really interesting is maybe a combination of virtual reality and augmented reality, or augmented reality on its own, particularly for a number of areas. So In the pandemic, healthcare has been a big growth area for this, and you can see actually one of our paramedics working on 5G with an augmented reality headset. That headset can beam in real time, high definition pictures back to a medic or a doctor in a hospital with a VR or an AR headset on, to be honest, but mostly VR, so they can do remote diagnostics. And then prior to the pandemic, we maybe had a bit of pushback saying, no, we need to be with the patients. Now, of course, it's highly desirable not necessarily to be with the patient. So a lot of that stuff, and that also includes, we've got remote stethoscopes and all sorts of things, all sorts of instrumentation that we can beam back to either a medical professional in a contact center or in a hospital to actually start to do remote diagnostics. We've also got sort of engineering diagnostics growing. You can see a couple of instances there. One is one of our OpenReach engineers wearing a Microsoft HoloLens, and he's a baby engineer. He's got a remote engineer sitting again in an office, talking him through procedures. We can also overlay things up literally over one of his eyeballs using things like pattern recognition and AI to actually just auto label some of the wires that he's working with, because if you've ever peered into one of those boxes on the street, it's like spaghetti. I don't know how they actually ever do anything with them. So how can we help and train people and actually then utilize collaboration tools where people are working with their hands? And then one that we've been using in BT a lot is something called Cycle, which actually prevents engineer visits, but is far, far simpler than having a headset. That actually uses the mobile phone, the customer's mobile phone. So what we can do with that is, with permission from the customer, if they have, say, a broadband fault, we send them a little link, and that link enables us to take control of the camera and the light on their smartphone headset. Handset rather. So what we can then do is to say, show us what you've got plugged in. And again, we can use pattern recognition and AI overlay to say, these are standard wires, you put this into this port. Again, prior to the pandemic, that cut down the number of engineering visits that we had to have. So the contact center agent, the expert agent in the back, was able to talk customers through plugging stuff in. So we didn't have to send so many engineers out to say, yeah, you've got that in the wrong plug. Obviously, pandemic-wise, we don't really necessarily want engineers in a house. So that kind of remote diagnostic capability has been hugely valuable to not just cut engineering visits down, but to make sure that our engineers don't have to go into people's houses. And it's a win-win situation. It saves cost, but it also helps the customer get back online as fast as we can possibly get them. So that is an interesting dynamic shifting the way that we work from home, the way we work from an office, and the way that we work in the field. And all of those things kind of blur together, and that can be a problem. Linked to Dolly, which is one of my favorite trends. This is Dolly Parton, by the way, and Dolly's not dead. She's very much alive. I'm a huge Dolly fan, but of course the 9 to 5 is an interesting one. And I mentioned before around, everything is starting to get questioned. Why do we need a 9 to 5? And to be honest, in contact centers, yeah, well, what is 9 to 5 half the time? Because a lot of us are on different rotas. But I think one of the problems with the blurring of home and work is that it's not about keeping people working, it's actually about stopping people working. And as I said, if you're on a shift, fine. If you're not on a shift, there is a temptation to work longer and longer hours. And although we typically see 20% extra productivity from home-based employees compared to their office-based counterparts, there is a negative to that. And again, a lot of us are finding it around burnout. So how do we make sure that people are taking breaks, that people aren't working longer and longer hours? And this is some work that we've done both with Cambridge University and with Lancaster University. This probably applies more to managers than agents, because again, there is a temptation to do lots of email, to respond to things because I need to be, always available because I'm not seen in the contact center of the office anymore. So I must demonstrate that I'm working really, really hard and be tethered back to my machine constantly. I have death by meeting days. I'm having to take on too much. I'm multitasking, which in itself makes us horribly unproductive, by the way, because our technologies might be throwing lots of things at us, but We don't really multitask, we time slice. And that's, I describe it as brain juggling. If we physically juggled for 7 hours a day, we'd be tired. Our brain is doing that frequently. So partially it's about how do we prioritize things and maybe single task and concentrate on one thing at a time. Obviously, we've got lots of technologies that we're having to cope with, particularly again, we've shifted to home working. We're coping with things like video that we might not have used before, and collaboration tools, too many of them, all of which work in very different ways. And obviously, again, in contact center collaboration, when you do have a remote workforce, is really important. But too many collaboration tools confuses us, and maybe doesn't get us collaborating, it fragments us. So how do we get, education? So what platforms should we be using? How do we bring people together appropriately on common ground? My definition of common ground is it has to be appropriate to the task and available to everybody. That's not necessarily a technology decision, that's a leadership decision. Where do I get my people to meet? How do I collaborate? How do I communicate with them? And then that pressure to be always on is not a good pressure. That causes us to not sleep and work longer hours. So finding the off switch is really important, and actually the topic of a new paper that will be out next week that's called the Balanced Communication Diet for Business. And that's designed, it's a diet that we actually originally did with Cambridge University. We were going to call it Cambridge Diet, but sadly someone got there before us. But it's basically a 5-step plan for people that are struggling with this always on pressure. The ability to disconnect is a problem for them. How do you actually take a step-by-step and step back to say, how do I reduce this? How do I turn off? And then there is a pressure, and certainly economic downtimes make people paranoid that they're going to lose their jobs. And of course, the droid comes into this one as well. So that paranoia and the hype all about AI and chatbots, and are they going to replace us? And you can see from this data, which is actually some research that we did a couple of years back, we're about to do this research again, just interviewing people to say, what do you think the impact of AI is going to be on your job? I am slightly anxious that 37% of people would rather talk to a robot than their boss, but largely I think the consensus is that we need to look through the hype. It's not necessarily going to replace humans, it's going to augment them, and the biggest impact is going to be things in the back end, so automation of back end process, robotic process automation, rather than necessarily the rise of the chatbot. And if you want to listen to my other webinar, you'll see a little bit about what customers think about chatbots, and maybe they're not delivering the customer experience that they should be. Ultimately, it has got a ripple back effect on the contact center. Very briefly, we did publish a paper last year called Botman versus Super Agents, as if it was a struggle, because actually it's not, because humans do things that machines do very badly and vice versa. And machines do very well when there's a lot of data and a lot of process and a lot of procedures. We do really well when there's a lot of emotion and empathy and complexity and all of that lovely stuff. So actually we were already seeing a shift in the contact center away from the transactional mundane stuff and much more towards the value add. So whether you're Sally picking up a conversation where a chatbot failed and using the power of the human brain to solve problems for customers. Paula, who's tackling those complex problems when computers said no. Absolutely critical to get right. Natalie, who's negotiating with customers. And negotiation, although it's rules and process based, also requires empathy. And that, again, machines are not very good at. I think we're going to need a lot of Natalies in our contact centers. And to be honest, they're kind of the high-level escalations people at the moment. Tony's a techie. A lot of the knowledge is up here. It's very difficult when the knowledge is up here to translate that into something that a machine can learn. And obviously, to a certain extent, our advisors will be training the AI and the bots and doing quality assurance. But actually getting the knowledge from up there into a knowledge base, yeah, we can do it, but that experience is irreplaceable. And again, techies are going to be required. And then I included Chris. I call him a crowdsourced advisor. He could be a customer. He could be an advisor in the cloud that has very specific skills. So that's kind of the ripple back effect that we're seeing in terms of these super agents, we call it, into the future, because automation is changing the contact center job into a very complex and emotive one. So it's not botman versus super agent at all. Droids are not going to take over. They are, however, going to augment us. And I think the one thing that we've learned, certainly in the contact center space, is when you're looking at digital experiences, it's very easy to copy a digital experience. What's less easy to copy are your agents and the talent and skills that they have. And that actually makes it a brand thing. It's an absolute brand differentiator if you've got super agents, probably powered by machines in automation, but not replaced by them. So I think that's a really positive thing, rather than necessarily finishing the presentation, I guess, on the negative. So that's kind of the view that we're getting. There's a load of papers behind this. If you do want the home working tips, that's out. Balanced communication diet is actually out next week. We've also got some broader stuff on the future of the workplace coming out in 2 weeks' time as well. So please do, if you want any of that stuff, please do yell, and we'll make sure that you get some bedtime reading to help you to sleep. Oh, I think that's the end, Dorothy. Back over to you if you've got any questions.
I do, and that was perfect timing. I don't know how you managed that, exactly 2:30. So well done, Nicola. First, and Mary said you sort of explained it, but she'd just like a bit more detail on it. Please explain a little bit more about activity-based working. What are some examples of this?
Sure, activity-based working, basically the concept is you walk into your office and you go, what am I doing today? And rather than going to find your desk, what you do is you move to the environment that best supports that activity. And that will vary as to what your office is for. So in terms of activity-based working in a contact center, it might be, if you're a phone-based agent, you have an acoustic environment. If you primarily deal with chat or email, it will be a slightly quieter environment. You don't need the acoustic shielding. So it's really around, I guess, providing a little bit more choice and fluidity in terms of the office space. Less seen in a contact center. I've seen a few like that. As I said, Airbnb is a good example. More mainstream probably in general office spaces, where you do get a fairly high throughput of transient workers who then, get to book the environment that best supports what they do. So that's the concept behind activity-based working.
And I think, Nicola, just to add to that, you see that in a lot of the newer centres at the moment, where you go and there's the little pods that people can go in and close the door, and people sort of know if they're in there, they're working on something that's, they need the space and the mind and the quietness to do. And obviously, if they're out in an open plan, they're pretty much open to somebody going over and maybe having a chat with them. I think you certainly see sort of spaces in the newer centres. And Mary said thank you. James has asked about accessing the white paper. So James, you can either drop me an email afterwards, connect with Nicola on LinkedIn, and what we did after the last webinar, we put it up on the CCMA events page along with the recording of the previous webinar. So Nicola, the big question: will there be contact centres? Will we survive this?
I think there will. I think contact centres are very, having studied them for a very long time, they are very social environments, inevitably. They are environments, certainly if you have more complex, more emotive calls, you do need that support network. So I think that there is certainly the social aspect of the contact center that a lot of people find fun. But I think in terms of, I'm firmly of the belief that we should give choices to people. We call it variously work from anywhere or smart working. Because everyone is different, everyone has different favorite places to work. So I think opening up those choices to everywhere between, home, co-working or, permanent contact center is a good thing, not a bad thing. So I think it is all about choice. But I can't see any office spaces or contact center spaces necessarily disappearing. They may change. Because obviously not just the pandemic, but the technology, the cultural attitudes, the way that we're all getting very used to remote working now, that's actually changed a lot of the culture. I think that maybe those trials back in 1992 proved it worked. So how do we keep on doing it into the future?
And I think just what's interesting, that from talking to a lot of members in the last couple of weeks, Nicola, is a lot of them seem to be undertaking employee surveys saying, do you want to come back to work? Have you underlying health conditions that mean you can't come back to work, childcare, all of the other factors that obviously the pandemic is impacting in terms of people's ability to return back to the office. And obviously the restrictions are being lifted in Ireland and in England at different times. But I think the other thing that will come out of this, well, I think is the role of workforce planners, because I think that's going to become a much more complex job, because you'll have different resources available at different times to do different activities. So I think that's one area that I know a lot of people are looking at from a specialist area. James has another question, Nicola. So Nicola, do you feel that in re-engineering to deal with omni-channel contact centres, there is a focus on cost reduction at the expense of delivering better customer experience?
Yeah, I mean, see my previous talk. I think one of the things, without doing the talk again, one of the things that we found is that there are some exceptionally bad digital experiences out there that are actually driving customers back to traditional channels like the phone. So although it might be cool to look at chatbots, you've got to ask yourself, does this actually create an easier, better customer experience? And if the answer is no, yeah, you probably need to think again in terms of deploying that, and certainly in terms of cost cutting. You know, what you can inadvertently do is, by putting, you know, a cheaper channel in, is drive people to the more expensive channel because the digital channel just didn't work. So I think the emphasis really in terms of the customer piece, and obviously this has got an impact on what agents do, is to get that digital experience good, so that actually the agents add the value of a human brain on the more complex and emotive stuff. So yeah.
Great, thanks. And James, just to say again, the recording of that webinar is up on our website. If you just want to drop me an email, dorothy@ccma.ie, I can send you all the links, so save you a little bit of time in finding that. And I suppose the last question, Nicola, if you were a company now, where we all are, you know, in terms of what's happening and opening, what should be the two or three things they should be doing now to prepare and to envisage a new workforce of the future, a new way of working for customer service operations?
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking for a while around I mean, I think the personas I showed earlier around botman versus super agent was really our thinking around particularly the skill sets that we need. So the skill sets we need from our agents are more around adding that value. So adding the brand value, adding the value of the human brain. And then that's got a huge impact on, you know, how we empower the agents, how we certainly give them the knowledge, because one of the problems, I think, is we get into a more complex universe, because frankly, you know, products and services are getting more rather than less complex. We can't train agents constantly, so that's a classic example of how do we bring the automation piece into the mix, so that the agents can concentrate on the customer relationship whilst not having to have their brains continuously trained and updated on more and more complex things. So how do we get knowledge systems and AI to actually work with the agent better? And there are lots of technologies that we're looking at to try and enhance agents. But I do think, you know, firstly, the skill sets are changing. I've also said, you know, if you're talking remote agents, potentially your agents could be the people in the field that are closest to the problem, which is why we have also been looking at that field worker aspect to customer experience as well, because we kind of always look at it as front office, back office, but actually from a customer perspective, that's all one delivery mechanism. So how do we make sure that we tie that together, and potentially if the problem is right at that sort of front end, the remote diagnostic piece, push the problem solving to the front end rather than necessarily bottleneck it into a centralized sort of contact center model. But I think, you know, the technologies like cloud gives us a lot of freedom effectively to start to think slightly differently. And we're also bringing a lot of our contact center propositions really into the unified comms space as well, because we recognize that with more complex supply chains and, you know, multiple people in multiple organizations having to work together on behalf of the customer does require a significant amount of collaboration as well. So how do we get agents to talk to people along that supply chain who have the knowledge that can manage the customer experience better? So that's where our heads are definitely at the moment.
And actually, just to build on that, we have a company in Ireland, I don't think they'll mind me quoting them, because they did an event for me last year, Sun Life in Waterford, and they brought in that concept of intelligence swarming, which is that notion that on one call, you bring in the expert who can help the frontline agent, and the frontline agent learns from sort of listening to the solution. But from a customer's perspective, there doesn't need to be a ticket issued because the problem is solved there and then. And that's something that I know a couple of companies were looking at that as a model that was really working and was, you know, improving employee engagement, employee skill sets, and also obviously enhancing customer satisfaction, because the problem was solved. There was no sort of follow-up required, which was interesting. Great.
Yeah.
Well, Nicola, thank you again. I know Emma's on the webinar, so I think we will have to book you now for these new white papers. I think you're not going to get away with just two webinars, so we might be back in touch, and we might try and get dates when you might be available to present those, because I think there'll be a huge amount of interest in those as well. So can I thank you on behalf of everybody? We had a great attendance today, and really appreciate your time. And hopefully we'll get to talk to you again in another few weeks. We'll get a few more dates in the diary. And as I said, the presentation, the recording, and the links to the various white papers will be available in the next day or two. Thanks a million. Thanks, Niamh. Thanks, Nicola. Take care. Bye.
Bye.